Have you ever had the feeling that someone close to you was getting ready to leave, even without saying a word? That hug lingered a little longer. That look held something you couldn't quite decipher. I did, and I ignored it. Until the letters started appearing, all handwritten, all speaking of a peace that didn't quite match the pain of those leaving. But there was one detail impossible to ignore. None of them seemed to have actually been written by the victims. My name is Katherine, and what you're about to hear about now is the case that changed everything for me. A trail of silent disappearances connected by cryptic messages that seemed like a script from someone playing with the line between choice and manipulation. The kind of story that, if I told it outside of a report, you'd swear it was fiction. But it's not. It happened, and it could still be happening right now, somewhere. The question that has been on my mind ever since is simple, yet frightening. How far can someone be pushed without realizing they're no longer in control? What if the decision to leave was never the victim's, but rather the one who knew how to rewrite their pain as a form of liberation? Before we begin, answer me one question. Where are you watching this video from? I might have already investigated a case right there, in your city. Write in the comments. Maybe the story is closer than it seems. I'm not usually easily impressed. After so many years exploring the depths of the human mind and the dark alleys of the soul, I've learned to expect the unexpected. But nothing prepared me for what I found that late afternoon, when I received a manila envelope with no return address and a farewell letter inside. The detail? The person who had written it had disappeared 2 days earlier, and according to family members, she hated writing anything by hand. At first, it seemed like another case of a planned escape. An emotional letter, sentences that suggested weariness with life, a shaky signature, but there was something there that deeply bothered me, as if every word was out of place. I read and reread the text for hours, feeling an almost physical discomfort, as if the message hadn't been written by someone who truly wanted to leave. And I was right. This was just the beginning. It wasn't long before another letter appeared. Then another. 3 disappearances in less than a week. 3 letters with similar structures, similar sentiments, and the same ending. Don't look after me. I am at peace. From that moment on, I stopped seeing them as isolated suicides. I'd read real letters before. These ones, they had something more, or less, as if they were truly empty. That's when I started to wonder, who's writing these goodbyes? And more importantly, who's making these people disappear? Deep down, I knew, even before I had proof. Someone was controlling this narrative, and as absurd as it sounds, it wasn't just ordinary manipulation. It was something deeper, almost invisible, as if someone knew how to write inside the victims' heads. It was winter 2017. The town of Santiago de Mar seemed to slumber under a constant veil of mist and silence. A small seaside town with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants, time seemed to slow down, and everyone knew everyone by their first name. The houses smelled of salt and damp wood, and the residents were so accustomed to their routine that even the birds seemed to sing at the same time. Until the letters started arriving. The first disappearance was hushed up by the hope that it was just a case of modern detachment, someone who left everything behind to start a new life, like you see in movies, but the second wasn't so easy to swallow. After the third, the whispers began. It was as if the city was trying to convince itself that everything was normal, even when the walls were covered in wanted posters. And each time the wind blew stronger, another name disappeared from the cafes and bakeries. No one dared speak of panic. But it already lived there, among the shuttered windows before 6, the suspicious glances. And the church that was now packed even on Tuesdays. The once welcoming town was becoming a labyrinth of secrets. I knew I wasn't just dealing with disappearances. The entire atmosphere breathed something strange, as if it were a silent accomplice to it all. The feeling was that something or someone was operating in the shadows. And it was right there, in that setting that seemed straight out of an old diary, that I began to delve deeper. It wasn't just the weather that was cold. It was as if the city itself was trying to hide something. And maybe, just maybe, what it was hiding was much closer than it seemed. Her name was Elisa Ramos, a 29-year-old literature teacher at the municipal high school, discreet, passionate about poetry and her morning classes. She was one of those people who effortlessly lit up a room, you know? When I received the missing person report, her classroom was still intact. Notebooks were stacked, chalk on the table, and in the center, a carefully folded sheet of paper, placed under an apple, as if it had been left for someone to find. It was the first letter. I read the content right there, surrounded by books and silence. The handwriting was cursive, beautiful, but there was something about it that bothered me. Small tremors in the stems, millimeter-perfect spacing, as if rehearsed. It didn't feel natural. More than that, it didn't feel emotional. The farewell spoke of liberation, of an invisible burden, but not a single word felt truly intimate. It lacked soul. And that, for me, was the biggest warning sign. I talked to my schoolmates. One of them, the vice principal, said something that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't seem sad, Katherine. She seemed light, like she'd resolved something. That kind of peace, on the eve of a disappearance, sounds more like surrender than relief. And when I saw Elisa's notebook, where she used to write her reflections, I realized the true contradiction. The writing there was completely different from the letter, more intense, less controlled. It was then that my deepest suspicion was born. What if that letter hadn't been written by her? Or worse, what if it had been written by Elisa, but under someone else's control? This idea gnawed at me, and at that point I still didn't know it. Elisa's story was just the first page of a much darker book. The second letter appeared 3 days later. Same situation. A missing young woman, Letitia, 22, a psychology student. The letter was found by her mother, folded in 4, inside her underwear drawer. The handwriting, remarkably similar to Elisa's. But what caught my attention most was the content. One passage in particular, repeated almost word for word. Pain is not a prison, it is the key. It was no coincidence, it was a pattern. The third letter came from a man this time. Raphael, 36, a pharmacy manager, married, with no history of depression or emotional crises. He disappeared, leaving an even more enigmatic message. I was chosen to understand what you pretend to forget. When I gathered the 3 letters and began to layer the sentences, I noticed they complemented each other, like lines from a dark poem. They weren't just goodbye notes. They were pieces of a well-crafted psychological game. And then came the most bizarre detail. When I shined a special light on the papers, a technique used in forged documents, I noticed a hidden signature, like a watermark between the lines. The guardian of choice, repeated in all 3 cases. This wasn't just a poetic nickname, it was an authorial signature. Someone was behind these letters, guiding each victim's words like puppets in an invisible theater. It was at that moment that I realized I wasn't just investigating disappearances. I was dealing with an author, a hidden narrator who wrote escape stories with dark endings, leaving an almost imperceptible trace that he was the one driving them all. And like every well-written story, this one seemed to have a next chapter waiting for me. It was when I saw the 4th letter that the case stopped being purely professional. The missing woman's name was Marina Rios. She was 31 years old, with dark eyes and a smile that hid storms. Her letter was the shortest of all, but it contained a sentence that knocked me down. If I disappear, it's not an escape. It's a reunion. That gave me chills, because it was exactly what my sister used to say when she felt overwhelmed by the world. My sister Laura disappeared 9 years ago. The case was never solved. No letter, no clues, just emptiness. For years, I'd learned to deal with this as an investigator, separating reason from emotion. But that sentence from Marina, it seemed Laura herself had written it. I went to the victim's house. Seeing her photo on the bookshelf, my knees went weak. They had the same haircut, the same lost look. I walked back to my car in silence. I sat in the driver's seat and took a deep breath. It's one thing to investigate someone's disappearance. It's another to face the ghost of the one you love in every detail. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe Laura hadn't left by choice. Maybe she too had received a letter. Or worse, maybe she'd written one guided by someone. From that moment on, the investigation became personal. It wasn't just about finding a criminal. It was about understanding whether what took these people also took my sister. And the truth is, the more I got involved, the more I felt this story was far from being just a coincidence. The first solid clue came from an unexpected source. the office of a psychologist named Dr. Henrique Salas. A methodical, soft-spoken man with an observant gaze, he contacted me spontaneously after seeing the news reports of the disappearances. According to him, at least 3 of the missing people had attended sessions with him in the last 2 months. And there was something they had in common that he could no longer ignore: their dreams. They all reported the same dream pattern: dreams of a shadowy figure, sometimes male, sometimes neutral, but always with the same voice. A calm, almost hypnotic voice that said phrases like, "You've already fulfilled your role here," or "Departure is the next step." The most curious thing? These people didn't present psychotic symptoms. There were no visible deep traumas. They seemed lucid, but suggestible, as if something were shaping them from within. Dr. Henrique said he considered collective manipulation or media influence, but the repetition of the dreams, with identical phrases, was too much to be a coincidence. I showed him excerpts from the letters. He paled. He recognized the exact words spoken in the session. They were being groomed, he said, and I didn't realize it. That left me cold. This wasn't just a criminal investigation. It was as if we were dealing with a script being implanted in the victims' minds. What if someone was driving all this not with threats, but with ideas? Ideas planted, nurtured subtly until they felt like authentic choices. The mind, when touched in the right places, can become an ally to the tormentor himself. And perhaps, in that moment, the voice in the dreams wasn't just a symbol. Maybe it was real, and closer than we thought. I sent the letters for a thorough examination. Handwriting, pen pressure, ink composition, everything. And the results were disturbing, to say the least. The analyses indicated that the texts were written in an altered state of consciousness. The experts suggested a condition compatible with mild hypnosis or some kind of deep induction. There were no signs of tremors typical of stress, no hesitation in the words. The sentences flowed as if they were being dictated from within. The strangest thing was that each letter carried personal traits, slang, expressions, even little inside jokes that only close friends would recognize. This made it difficult to suspect forgery. They seemed authentic, yet fabricated, as if the writer were present but absent. The person's mind was there, but the intention, perhaps not. And that, to me, was more frightening than any physical threat. I spoke with an expert in subliminal language. He analyzed the patterns and stated that some of the letters' textual constructions resembled scripts used in behavioral indoctrination, such as those used in cults or psychological reconditioning programs. One of the phrases even appeared as a classic example of identity erasure. "My absence is my present." This made it clear to me that there was more than a criminal mastermind behind it. There was a methodology. For the first time in my career, I began to consider that the weapon used in these crimes might not have been a knife, nor captivity. Perhaps it was an idea, well planted, well nurtured, and cruelly effective. And if so, I needed to understand who was writing these ideas inside the victims, and how far could he or she go. I spoke with each of the victims' families. It wasn't easy. Dealing with the pain of others requires caution and silence at the right moments. But a pattern emerged in the stories, and it kept me alert. Before they disappeared, they all went through small changes that, at the time, seemed insignificant. Sudden insomnia, loss of appetite, emotional detachment. Nothing drastic, but continuous. As if they were slowly disconnecting. The detail that intrigued me most came in the final conversations. Some parents, siblings, or partners reported that, in their final days, the victims were calm. Not sad, not agitated, calm, an uncomfortable serenity, as if they had made peace with something the others didn't even know was in conflict. One even said, "It was as if she knew she was leaving, but without telling us where." This artificial tranquility reeked of mental programming to me. I've seen this before in victims of intense psychological manipulation. When the mind is convinced that escape is the only way to free itself, it stops fighting. And when that happens, disappearance ceases to be an escape, it becomes a mission. This realization completely changed my train of thought. If these people weren't running away, but rather fulfilling a role, who had written this script? And why did all the families, without exception, say that even in their final moments, there was something they couldn't grasp in the victims? An absent gaze, an incomplete presence, as if they were there physically, but their souls had already departed. But where to? It was on a rainy night that I decided to return to Dr. Henrique's old office. He had closed the place a few months earlier, but he still had the keys. He let me in without many questions, as if he knew I needed to see something for myself. The place was intact, as if frozen in time. The dim light from the flashlight revealed dusty folders, underlined books, and, in a locked drawer, a box of cassette tapes. The title of one of them caught my eye, Session 14, Marina. I took the contents to a small room I'd set up as the investigation hub. I plugged in the recorder and began listening. At first, it was just the sound of the patient breathing. Then, the psychologist's voice guiding relaxation. But something about his tone bothered me. It was firmer than it should have been. When Marina's voice emerged, it sounded numb. And in the background, music. The same melody, repetitive, almost childish, like those on old music boxes. And it played, constantly. As the sessions progressed, the voices became more distorted, as if someone had manipulated the tapes. But these weren't ordinary interferences. They were overlapping voices with hidden messages. Accept the transition. You are beyond the now. To forget is to free. They seemed like subtle commands, but with a weight that pierced the heart. This wasn't a simple therapy session. This was conditioning. I stopped the recording and stared at the recorder for a few seconds, silent. It was as if I had discovered a soundtrack for the surrender of fragile minds, a constant noise hidden behind the apparent healing. And in that moment, I realized that someone had learned to hypnotize with words and music. And the scariest thing? Maybe they were still doing it to others. Maybe even now. I returned to the tapes the next day, my stomach already churning with anticipation. Among the audio files, one recording was marked only with a symbol drawn in pen, a circle crossed by 2 vertical lines. I pressed play. The voice belonged to Elisa, the first victim, and her tone was different. She wasn't hypnotized, but surrendered, as if she'd accepted something inevitable. At one point in the session, she whispers, "He said he'd write for me." The goodbye I could never say alone. That kept bouncing around in my head for days. Writing for me. It wasn't just about control. It was about creating a narrative. Someone was helping these people say goodbye, but with words that didn't come from within. It was as if someone had taken on the role of author of the last page of their lives. And the cruelest part, he did it with a tone of compassion, as if it were a favor, a psychological gift. I continued listening to the tape. Elisa spoke of dreams of open doors, places where time doesn't exist, and a presence that smiles without a face. She described a state of relief, as if the idea of disappearing brought rest. And then, the line that stopped me in my tracks. He told me that disappearing isn't the end, it's just a way of leaving space. The calculated coldness behind it was chilling. We weren't dealing with impulses. We were dealing with someone who deeply understood how the desire to escape works. I closed the recorder with a lump in my throat. With each clue, it became clearer that these victims were persuaded, not coerced, driven to the edge of reason by someone who knew exactly where to press the button. And if he could write these goodbyes with such precision, what else was he writing without anyone noticing? I reached a point in the investigation where it wasn't enough to just follow leads. I needed to understand who was behind them, what he was after, why he did it, and even more, how he managed to maintain so much control. I began to build a psychological profile based on the recurring patterns. The perpetrator of the manipulations wasn't impulsive. He was meticulous, intelligent. He knew when to tap into the human mind to flip an internal switch, silent yet devastating. Everything indicated traces of heightened narcissism. Not the vain, mirror-like kind, but the narcissism of someone who believes he has the right to direct other people's lives, a sense of moral superiority. As if he were saving these people from their own pain. He didn't act out of hatred or revenge. He acted out of conviction. As if he were an architect of liberation, an author of less cruel endings, according to his own twisted logic. More than that, he was a learned man. The letters and phrases in the audio recordings contained philosophical references, fragments from existentialist authors, and even elements of distorted spiritualist doctrines. A manipulator who read deeply and applied what he read. He turned ideas into invisible traps, using language like a knife, and he did it with pleasure. The pleasure of watching someone surrender without realizing they're being led. It was then that the most uncomfortable thought of all occurred to me. What if he didn't choose victims randomly? What if he selected people based on their subtle emotional fragility, like someone choosing a tired chess piece? If that's the case, we're not just talking about a criminal. We're talking about an emotional strategist, capable of erasing people, without leaving a physical trace. Only words. And words in this game were lethal. I began to notice something that had previously gone unnoticed. In the original letters, not the copies or scans, but the papers themselves, there was a barely discernible symbol in the lower right corner. A circle with 2 vertical lines cutting through the center, like a seal of sorts. It was too subtle to be casual, but specific enough to be a signature. I used chemical reagents and a black light to better reveal it. The symbol was on all of them. I showed the brand to a former college professor, a specialist in behavioral psychology. When he saw the drawing, his eyes widened. He told me about an experimental group that existed in the 1990s called Psychic Transition Circle, an unofficial project formed by students and therapists interested in testing emotional induction techniques. The group was allegedly disbanded after a scandal involving sessions without ethical consent. According to him, the symbol was a graphic representation of the inner passage, a concept that held that the human mind could be guided to other states of existence through combined stimuli, word, sound, and deep emotional meaning. It was strange and dangerous. I was dealing, perhaps, with someone who had not only been part of this group, but had honed their methods on their own. From that point on, each letter ceased to be just a goodbye note. It became evidence of a psychological legacy that survived in the shadows. The question I couldn't stop asking was the group truly extinct? Or had it simply reinvented itself with new names, new victims, and a more discreet signature? I went back to rummaging through my sister Laura's past, like someone reading an old letter, searching for words hidden between the lines. I found a box of her notebooks, some I'd never seen before. Amid the pages filled with confused thoughts and abstract drawings, there were loose notes about an alternative study group, something she secretly attended during college. One name came up more than once: Transition Circle. My heart raced. I began to cross-reference dates and locations, and everything began to fit together with a precision that took my breath away. Lara had attended unofficial meetings linked to the same group that originated the symbol on the cards. Nighttime sessions, induction practices, experiments in emotional liberation, all documented in short sentences, scribbles, and reflections that, at the time, seemed like mere teenage musings. But now, they were central pieces of a puzzle too personal to ignore. I showed the notebooks to a contact from my old university. He confirmed that yes, there was a core group of students who participated in unofficially recognized activities. He said some dropped out after mild outbursts. Others simply disappeared. That's when I understood. My sister wasn't just another missing person. She may have been one of the first, one of the guinea pigs, and perhaps the first letter never written was hers. The ground dropped away from under my feet. Until then, I believed I was investigating an external professional case. But now it was personal on the deepest level possible. The shadow I was chasing wasn't new. It had been haunting me for almost a decade. And the hardest thing to swallow was the possibility that, even before I realized it, I was already part of this story. After weeks of tracking down names linked to the so-called Transition Circle, I located the man listed as the group's activities leader, Dr. Marcelo Trigueros, today a retired, reclusive gentleman, living on a remote farm in the interior of Minas Gerais. I arrived unannounced, knocking on the wooden gate. When I introduced myself, he hesitated. His look wasn't one of surprise. It was one of someone who had already expected someone to come and ask about it one day. We talked on the porch. He lit cigarette after cigarette with trembling hands. He said the group's ideas had been taken too far, and that he'd lost control when they began experiencing emotional archetype activation. I talked about the letters, the symbol, the disappearances. He listened silently. But it was only when I mentioned the name written between the lines, the guardian of choice, that he truly paled. The cigarette fell from his hand. His mouth began to move, but no words came out. It was as if he'd been transported to a place he'd sworn never to visit again. A few seconds later, he got up, went inside, and returned with an envelope. Inside was an old manuscript, on yellowed paper, titled Voluntary Transition Manual, by Guardian. It was like finding the primary source of a forbidden doctrine. The professor looked at me and said, "If that name is back in circulation, then someone never abandoned the experiment." Before I could ask any more questions, he had a sort of seizure, sweating, shaking, staring into space. I had to call for medical help, but I already knew enough. The Guardian wasn't a concept. He was an individual, someone with a name, a face, a history, and worse, someone who even decades later still felt entitled to decide who should go and why. Using the manuscript provided by the professor, I began investigating names mentioned in the notes. One of them recurred frequently, Daniel Reese. He wasn't a faculty member, nor an official member of the group, but he appeared as an external collaborator, someone who participated in the sessions as a volunteer patient. A curious detail: after the group closed, all of Daniel's records simply disappeared. No diploma, no address, no trace, as if he had vanished. I obtained an old photo, taken during a group lecture, and used facial recognition. After a few attempts, I found a recent record, but under a different name. He was now living as Andre Luca, an alternative therapist in a town neighboring the first victim, Elisa. He offered deep emotional reprogramming and psychic realignment sessions. The penny dropped with incredible force. The real guardian of choice was never the teacher. It was Daniel, a patient, trained to replace the master. I looked through the records of the office where he worked. Guess who was listed as a client? Marina, Raphael, and Letitia. All the names were there, disguised under pseudonyms. Sessions scheduled shortly before the disappearances. Times coincided with the days of the last letters. The connection was impossible to ignore. Daniel, or rather, Andre, had inherited the experiment and turned it into a personal mission. He was now the author of the goodbyes. In that moment, everything changed. The enemy I'd imagined as a cold, distant mind now had a face, an address, and a method. And worst of all, he presented himself to the world as someone who healed, a therapist of the soul, when in reality, he was writing endings in lives still under construction. It was during a conversation with a therapeutic regression specialist that I decided to try something I'd always avoided: revisiting my own memory. The doctor suggested a non-invasive but intense mental reconstruction technique. The idea was simple: to access, through guided awareness, the fragments my mind might have hidden about the night Lara disappeared. I accepted, but I confess I wasn't prepared for what would come. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let the images emerge. First, clear scenes came. Lara and I laughing in the bedroom, her listening to music through headphones too big for her head. Then, the memories began to blur. A repetitive sound, soft words, as if someone were whispering behind the wall. A voice, familiar and strange at the same time. It said, "Now you understand." And then, the door closed. I stood still, frozen, and Lara disappeared. I woke up in tears, with a feeling that something inside me had been unlocked, but also with a painful certainty. I was there when it all began. I heard the voice, I felt the presence. I simply blacked out. Whether out of trauma, fear, or manipulation, my mind chose to forget. And this discovery challenged me as an investigator. How can you trust your own memories when they may have been shaped? If Daniel was able to access my sister's mind, maybe he accessed mine too. And if that's true, I'm not just the hunter in this story. I'm just another piece on the board. And the question that's haunted me ever since is, how much of what I remember really happened? I spent weeks with that empty feeling, filled by something I couldn't yet name. Until one day, reviewing my sister's notes, I noticed something strange. Certain words, certain phrases were in the victim's letters. Only there, they were written by me. In old diaries I hadn't even remembered existed. The handwriting was mine, but the logic behind those sentences, it wasn't. They followed the same structure as the induced messages. It was as if I'd been trained to forget. With the therapist's help, I began to identify patterns. The same soundtrack that played on the tapes appeared. in an instrumental version in a playlist saved on my computer from years ago. The same rhythmic breathing from Marina's sessions. It was described in my notebook as an inner focus technique taught by an emotional mentor who, until then, I thought was the product of some random self-discovery course. But it wasn't. It was him. It was Daniel. It was hard to accept that, at some point in my past, I too had been touched by the experiment, perhaps briefly, perhaps partially, but I had. My mind erased, reshaped, rebuilt. And now, by bringing it to light, I understood more deeply what the victims had felt, that false peace, that unexplained surrender, the feeling that leaving was a choice, when in fact it was a disguised command. Looking in the mirror after that was like facing a stranger who knew too much. I'd always considered myself observant, rational, but this revelation put me on the other side of the line. The difference between victim and investigator, sometimes it's just time. And maybe, until now, I've only escaped because for some reason, it hasn't finished rewriting me. I rummaged through boxes, old folders, forgotten drawers, until, inside a hardcover book, I found a yellowed envelope with my name handwritten on it. I couldn't remember seeing it before. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled many times but never delivered. I opened it with trembling hands. It was Laura's handwriting, and there it was, the letter, the goodbye she never got to give me, or that someone had prevented me from finding until now. The words had a sweet tone, but also a dull ache. If I go, it's not because I've given up on myself. It's because I've understood that I no longer recognize myself here inside. And then, halfway through, she spoke of a final test, a process that she said would free her from what she called looped memories, a place where thoughts would cease and only silence would remain. It was as if she'd been convinced that disappearance was healing. The most frightening thing is that the structure of the letter followed exactly the same pattern as the other victims. Gentle phrases, comforting mental images, and an almost poetic closing. But there, at the end, a different scribble, a drawing, the same symbol, circle and crossed lines, that I saw in the letters from the case. In other words, she too went through the same process. She too was guided, manipulated, perhaps by Daniel, perhaps by someone before him. I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't cry. It was as if the pain had been waiting for years to be felt and had finally found its place. That letter, never delivered, was now the missing piece to understanding everything. My sister didn't run away. She was persuaded to leave, and for some reason, she wanted to leave me a final clue, a whisper so I wouldn't forget her, or the truth. I located Daniel in a secluded inn, surrounded by woods and silence. He wasn't running away. He was there, as if waiting to be found, alone, without resistance, sitting in a wicker chair, gazing at the horizon as if finishing the last page of a book. When I introduced myself, he smiled. It took longer than I thought. "Katherine," he said, with a calmness that bordered on indifference, as if everything had already been written before it even happened. I walked in. The room was simple, but papers were scattered about, mind maps, notes with names, dates, and specific emotions. It was like entering the mind of a life scriptwriter. He showed me everything without hesitation. "I didn't do anything they didn't want," he said. "I just helped translate." I asked if he regretted it. He laughed. "Regret is the vice of those who don't understand their choice. I just wanted to prove that the mind writes what the heart can't bear to say." Daniel surrendered. No fight, no escape. He was taken away by the authorities with an almost serene air, as if that too was part of the plan. But the most disturbing thing was what he left on the table before leaving. A notebook. Inside a page with a single sentence. "You were writing too, Katherine. I just didn't know to whom." That struck me in a way no investigation ever has. I closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and looked around. It was the end of a search, but also the beginning of another question that would haunt me for a long time. How many stories do we live believing are ours, when in fact, they were planted within us? Since that day, I've never looked at a letter the same way. I realized that some goodbyes don't need to be written to exist. They lie between the lines of interrupted conversations, in the last glance before the door closes, in the silence that remains where there once was a presence. It doesn't matter if it was handwritten, dictated, or simply felt. A true goodbye isn't one that ends when the person leaves, but when we understand why they left. I spent years hunting for clues, interpreting signs, cross-referencing data. But I never imagined the deepest trail would lead to myself. Sometimes we chase monsters so complex that we forget to look at the shadow in the rearview mirror. Daniel fell. The case was closed. But part of it all remains here, in me. And perhaps as much as I won the investigation, I will never again be the same Katherine who started it. Because when you understand how someone can shape another human being's mind, you begin to doubt the soundness of your own thoughts. How many ideas are truly yours? How many decisions were born within, and how many were planted from outside? I still investigate. I still listen. But now, more carefully. Because the abyss doesn't smell of blood. It smells of familiarity. And if there's one thing I've learned from this case, it's that sometimes the mind lies. And the greatest illusion is believing we're completely in control. Perhaps that's why, to this day, I still occasionally hear a soft voice saying, "You were chosen too." After all this, I still find myself wondering, how many real stories end before they even begin? How many people live with the weight of a goodbye they didn't write because someone wrote it for them? The most dangerous thing isn't the one who shouts, it's the one who whispers. The one who knows the emptiness inside and learns to mold it until it feels like relief. This case taught me that the human mind is all too moldable, and that not all silence is a choice. If there's one thing I'll leave you with today, it's this. Notice the details, the unspoken words, the repeated gestures. Sometimes the greatest cry for help doesn't come in the form of a scream. It comes in a rehearsed smile, an unconvincing, "It's okay." And if someone close to you seems to be pulling away from you, maybe there's still time to pull them back before someone else takes them. The truth is, we're all susceptible. What protects us isn't strength, it's awareness. And if this story touched you in any way, perhaps you're already more aware than you realize. Now, if you want to continue following these real-life investigations, which blend mind, mystery, and memory, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. There's a lot I still need to tell you, and you'll want to be here when I do.